Hey everyone, welcome back. I've got another batch of stories for you today, and honestly, some of these are wild enough that I had to reread them twice just to make sure they were real. We're building something chill in our Minecraft world while we dive into 15 connected tales of lies, receipts, and the kind of karma that shows up with a highlight reel. Before we dive in, I just want to give a quick shout out to everyone who keeps showing up, dropping comments, and bringing the good vibes. You're the real MVPs. Seriously, thank you for making this channel so much more fun and awesome. So, our first story starts in the most humiliating place possible, a crowded store where someone decided to make a scene they couldn't back up. She accused someone of theft, demanded an apology even after being proven wrong, and had no idea the security cameras were about to end her entire narrative. I was having one of those quiet Saturday afternoons where you're just browsing, not really looking for anything specific, just enjoying the vibe of a local boutique I'd been to a few times before. The kind of place with soft lighting, indie music playing low, and price tags that make you wince but you browse anyway because sometimes you just want to feel fancy. I was near the accessories section, looking at scarves I definitely didn't need, when I heard someone behind me start to raise their voice. At first, I didn't think much of it. People have phone calls, right? But then the voice got louder, sharper, and I heard my general direction mentioned. I turned around, and there was this woman, maybe mid-40s, pointing directly at me, with this look of absolute fury on her face. She was practically vibrating with rage. "She stole my wallet," she announced to the entire store, not quietly, not as a question, as a full-blown accusation, loud enough that every single person in that boutique stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at me. I just stood there frozen, holding a scarf I'd been absent-mindedly touching, trying to process what was happening. My brain was doing that thing where it lags behind reality by a solid 5 seconds. She stole my wallet. She's talking about me. Wait, what? Excuse me? I finally managed, my voice coming out way calmer than I felt, which honestly surprised me because my heart was already pounding. "You heard me," she snapped, stepping closer, her finger still pointed at me like I was some kind of criminal on a wanted poster. "You took my wallet out of my purse. I saw you hovering near me earlier. I know it was you." I hadn't been anywhere near her. I didn't even know who she was. But before I could say that, she was already yelling for security, for the manager, for anyone who would listen. And people were listening. Oh, they were definitely listening. Other customers had stopped shopping entirely and were just watching this unfold like it was some kind of live performance. Two security guards appeared pretty quickly, which made sense because this woman was making enough noise to summon the entire staff. She immediately launched into this whole story about how she'd been shopping, set her purse down for just a second, and when she looked again, her wallet was gone. And she was absolutely certain, completely convinced, that I had taken it. One of the guards, a younger guy who looked like he really didn't want to be dealing with this, turned to me and asked if I'd be willing to let them check my bags. The way he asked was polite, almost apologetic, like he already knew this was ridiculous, but had to go through the motions anyway. "Of course," I said, and I meant it. I had nothing to hide. I opened my purse, my shopping bag, even turned out my jacket pockets. The guards went through everything carefully while this woman stood there, with her arms crossed, watching like a hawk, absolutely certain they were about to pull out her missing wallet and prove her right. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The guard looked at her and said, "Ma'am, there's no wallet here." You'd think that would be the end of it, right? You'd think she'd realize she made a mistake, apologize, maybe feel a little embarrassed, and we'd all move on with our lives. But no. Instead, she doubled down. "Well, she must have hidden it somewhere," she insisted, looking around like I'd somehow stashed her wallet in a rack of scarves when no one was looking. "Or maybe she already passed it to someone. Check the cameras." The manager had arrived by this point, a woman in her 50s who looked like she'd seen every flavor of customer meltdown and was thoroughly unimpressed. She calmly suggested that maybe the wallet had just been misplaced, and perhaps the woman should check her car, her other bags, retrace her steps. The woman huffed, glared at me one more time like I was personally responsible for ruining her day, and stormed out to the parking lot. I stood there, still surrounded by security guards and curious onlookers, feeling this weird mix of humiliation and anger. I hadn't done anything wrong, but I'd just been publicly accused of theft, searched like a suspect, and treated like a criminal in a store I actually liked shopping at. My hands were shaking. The manager apologized to me quietly, said she didn't believe for a second that I'd taken anything, and offered me a discount on anything I wanted to buy today, which was nice but didn't really undo the fact that I'd just been humiliated in front of a dozen strangers. Then came the breaking point. The woman came back inside, wallet in hand, looking sheepish for about half a second before her expression hardened again. I thought, okay, here it comes, the apology. The acknowledgement that she'd made a terrible mistake and accused an innocent person of a crime in public. But instead, she looked at me and said, "Well, you still made a scene. You should apologize for embarrassing me like that in front of everyone." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because the sheer audacity of what she'd just said short-circuited my brain for a second. She wanted me to apologize, to her, for being falsely accused of theft, for standing there while she screamed at me and had security search my belongings, for existing in her general vicinity while she lost track of her own wallet. The manager's face did something I can only describe as a controlled explosion. She turned to the woman and said, in the most professionally cold voice I've ever heard, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the store, now." The woman sputtered, tried to argue, said she was a loyal customer and this was outrageous. But the manager didn't budge. The security guards escorted her out, and I could hear her complaining loudly all the way to the parking lot about how she was being treated unfairly. I bought the scarf. I don't even like scarves that much, but it felt like I needed to reclaim something from that experience, and retail therapy seemed like the move. The manager thanked me for being so calm and understanding, gave me her card, and said if I ever had any issues to contact her directly. I left feeling rattled but at least somewhat vindicated, and here's where it gets absurd. 2 days later, a mutual acquaintance sent me a screenshot. The woman had posted about the incident on Facebook, but in her version of events, I was aggressive, confrontational, and had caused a massive scene in the store after being caught near her belongings. She painted herself as the victim of my hostility and the store's poor handling of the situation. She even tagged the boutique, clearly trying to get them in trouble or rally people to her side. I stared at that post for a solid minute, just absorbing the level of delusion it took to write that. She'd found her wallet in her own car. She knew she'd been wrong, and she still decided to lie about it publicly and make me the villain. I wasn't about to let that stand. I contacted the boutique and explained what had happened. The manager remembered me immediately and was horrified that this woman was now spreading lies online. She offered to send me the security footage from that day. I accepted. The footage was beautiful in its clarity. It showed me shopping alone, nowhere near this woman. It showed her setting her purse down in her shopping cart, her wallet clearly visible inside. It showed her walking away from the cart multiple times, coming back, rummaging through her purse, panicking, and then pointing at me. And most importantly, it showed her wallet sitting in that cart the entire time, exactly where she'd left it. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Now back to what happened when I got that security footage. I didn't post the footage publicly. I'm not trying to go viral or destroy someone's life over a stupid mistake, but I did send it along with a calm explanation of what had actually happened to the few mutual connections we had, the same people who'd seen her post and might have believed her version of events. The response was immediate. People were appalled, not just at the false accusation, but at the fact that she doubled down, refused to apologize, and then lied about it online. A few people commented on her post asking for her side of the story, now that they'd seen the footage. She deleted everything within an hour and blocked me. The boutique also took action. They banned her permanently from the store and added her photo to their internal system, so staff would recognize her if she tried to come back. The manager told me later that this apparently wasn't the first time she'd caused problems, just the most dramatic. I never heard from her directly. No apology, no acknowledgement, nothing. She just vanished from my social circle and presumably went on with her life, hopefully a little more careful about where she leaves her wallet. Looking back, the whole thing still feels surreal. The confidence it takes to accuse someone of theft, be proven completely wrong, and then demand an apology from your victim is just staggering. Some people really do live in their own reality, where they're never at fault, and everyone else is just a supporting character in their drama. But that wasn't even the wildest public accusation I've heard about. Wait until you hear what happened when someone's body camera told a completely different story than a screaming parent. I work security at a mid-sized mall, the kind of place where most days are pretty uneventful. You walk your routes, help people find the bathroom, occasionally deal with someone shoplifting cheap sunglasses, and that's about it. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and honestly, I like the routine. I've been doing it for about 3 years now, and in that time I've seen plenty of weird stuff, but nothing quite prepared me for what happened on a random Tuesday afternoon. We were in the middle of a renovation project near the food court. They were updating the flooring, replacing some ceiling tiles, the usual construction chaos. The area was clearly marked off with caution tape, orange cones, those big yellow signs that say restricted area in letters you could read from space. It wasn't subtle. You'd have to actively ignore multiple warnings to end up back there. I was doing a routine walkthrough near the perimeter when I noticed a kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, ducking under the caution tape and heading straight toward the construction zone. There were exposed wires, tools scattered around, sections of floor that had been pulled up. It was genuinely dangerous, especially for a child who clearly had no idea what he was walking into. I called out to him immediately, "Hey buddy, you can't go back there." He didn't stop. Kids that age sometimes don't register adult voices if they're focused on something, so I tried again, louder this time. "Hey, stop right there. It's not safe." Still nothing. He was maybe 10 feet into the zone now, heading toward a section where they'd removed part of the floor, and you could see straight down to the level below. My heart rate kicked up because this was about to go from a minor issue to a potential emergency real fast. I moved quickly, closing the distance, and gently put my hand on his shoulder to guide him back. "Hey buddy, can't go back there. It's dangerous," I said, keeping my voice calm and friendly, because the last thing I wanted to do was scare the kid. He looked up at me, startled but not upset, and I walked him back out of the construction zone, past the caution tape, and into the safe area of the food court. "Where's your mum?" I asked, scanning the area. He pointed vaguely toward the seating area, and I figured she'd probably just lost track of him for a second, which happens. Kids are fast, and parents can't watch them every single second. I was about to walk him over to find her when I heard someone screaming. Not calling out, not raising their voice. Screaming. A woman came sprinting toward me, face red, eyes wild, looking like she was ready to physically fight me in the middle of the mall. The kid's face lit up and he said, "Mommy," which confirmed what I'd already guessed, but that didn't stop her from completely losing it. "What did you do to my son?" she shrieked, loud enough that people 3 stores away turned to look. "You grabbed him! I saw you grab his arm!" I took a step back, hands up in a non-threatening gesture, trying to de-escalate. "Ma'am, your son was heading into a restricted construction area. I stopped him before he could get hurt. You had no right to touch him." She was in my face now, jabbing her finger toward me, her voice getting louder with every word. "You grabbed him aggressively. You could have hurt him. I want you fired. I'm calling the police. I'm suing this mall." A crowd was forming. This is one of those nightmare scenarios for anyone in security, because it doesn't matter what actually happened. All people see is someone yelling and a kid involved, and suddenly you're guilty until proven innocent in the court of public opinion. My supervisor, Derek, appeared pretty quickly because someone had radioed him that there was a situation near the food court. The woman immediately redirected her fury at him, demanding that I be fired on the spot, that she was going to sue for assault, that this was unacceptable and dangerous, and she wanted my name and badge number, and probably my home address if she could get it. Derek pulled me aside while another security guard stayed with the woman to try to calm her down, which was not going well based on the continued yelling I could hear behind me. "What happened?" Derek asked, and I could tell he was already bracing for whatever story was about to unfold. I stayed calm. I've been doing this long enough to know that losing your cool in these situations only makes things worse. Her kid went into the construction zone. I called out to him 3 times. He didn't stop, so I gently guided him back by the shoulder. "That's it. Check my body cam." Derek's expression shifted slightly. "We're required to wear body cams during every shift, and they're always recording when we're on duty. It's partly for liability, partly for evidence in situations exactly like this one." He nodded and said he'd pull the footage. The woman was still making a scene, telling anyone who would listen that I'd assaulted her child, that the mall was unsafe, that she was going to make sure everyone knew what happened here. The kid, meanwhile, seemed completely unbothered and was asking if he could get a pretzel. And here's where it gets absurd. Derek came back about 15 minutes later with a tablet showing the body cam footage. He called the woman over, and I could see her confidence falter just slightly when she saw the screen, like some part of her brain was starting to realize this might not go the way she thought it would. The footage was crystal clear. It showed the kid ducking under the caution tape. It showed me calling out to him once, twice, 3 times. It showed me walking over and placing my hand on his shoulder, gently, while saying, "Hey buddy, can't go back there, it's dangerous." It showed me walking him back to the safe area. And, most importantly, it showed the mother in the background the entire time, sitting at a table staring down at her phone, completely oblivious to where her kid was or what he was doing. Derek turned the tablet toward her. "Ma'am, this is the footage from his body cam. As you can see, he prevented your son from entering a dangerous construction area and did so without any aggression or inappropriate contact." Her face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Shock, embarrassment, anger, defiance, and then something that looked like she was trying to calculate her next move. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "I misunderstood the situation." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement that she'd just publicly accused me of assaulting a child based on absolutely nothing. Just, "I misunderstood the situation." Like that somehow made it okay. But that wasn't even the worst part. She looked at Derek and said, "He still should have asked my permission before touching my son. I think an apology is appropriate." I actually laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short, disbelieving exhale, because the nerve of this woman was genuinely impressive. She wanted me to apologize for stopping her kid from potentially falling through a hole in the floor while she was scrolling through Instagram or whatever she was doing on her phone. Derek's face went completely blank, which is his tell for when he's absolutely done with someone but trying to remain professional. He looked at her and said very calmly, "Ma'am, given the false accusations you've made against my employee and the disruption you've caused, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property. You're banned from this mall effective immediately." Her jaw dropped. "You can't do that." "I absolutely can," Derek said. "And I am. If you return, you'll be trespassed." She sputtered, tried to argue, said this was discrimination and she'd be calling corporate and leaving terrible reviews everywhere, but Derek didn't budge. Another security guard escorted her and her kid toward the exit, while she continued complaining the entire way. I thought that would be the end of it, a weird, unpleasant encounter that I'd laugh about later with my coworkers. But this woman was apparently committed to being wrong as loudly as possible. That night, she posted about the incident on the mall's Facebook page. Her version of events was wildly different from reality. According to her, I'd manhandled her son. The mall had covered it up, and she was warning other parents to avoid the location because their children weren't safe. She tagged the mall, tagged the parent company, and even tagged a few local news stations for good measure. The mall's social media team didn't mess around. They replied directly to her post with a polite but firm statement explaining that the incident had been reviewed, that body cam footage confirmed the security guard had acted appropriately to prevent a child from entering a dangerous area, and that the parent in question had been banned from the property for making false accusations. They even included the timestamp from the body cam footage, though they didn't post the actual video publicly because it involved a minor. The comments on her post were brutal. People were calling her out for lying, for not watching her own kid, for trying to destroy someone's job over her own negligence. A few people even recognized her from the mall and confirmed that she'd been the one screaming and causing a scene while her kid seemed perfectly fine. She deleted the post within a few hours. Then she deleted her entire Facebook account. I heard through the grapevine that she tried to complain to corporate, but once they reviewed the footage, they backed Derek's decision completely and confirmed the ban was staying in place. The whole thing left me feeling weird for a few days. On one hand, I was glad the body cam existed, because without it, this could have gone very differently. It could have been my word against hers, and in situations involving kids, people tend to believe the parent by default. But on the other hand, it was unsettling how quickly she was willing to lie, how aggressively she pushed a false narrative, and how little she seemed to care about the potential consequences for me. I still work at that mall. I still wear my body cam every shift, and I'm still grateful for the technology that kept a bad situation from becoming a career-ending disaster. The construction zone got finished a few weeks later, and I haven't seen that woman since, which is probably for the best. You almost have to admire the commitment to being wrong, though. Not everyone doubles down that hard and then tries to take it to social media. Speaking of people who thought they had the upper hand until evidence appeared, this next one involves a boss who really should have checked his sent folder first. I should have seen it coming the moment my boss walked into my office with that smile. You know the one. The kind that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that says, I'm about to ruin your week and I'm going to enjoy it. He dropped a folder on my desk, way too casual for what was inside, and said he had an exciting new project for me. Exciting. That should have been my first red flag. The project itself was massive. We're talking a complete data analysis report that would normally take a team of 3 people at least 2 weeks to compile, verify, and present. He wanted it done in 2 days, alone. And not just any analysis, he needed data from multiple departments, some of which required formal approval requests to access. Approvals that historically took anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks to process depending on how backed up the access request queue was. I pointed this out immediately. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I genuinely wanted to understand how he expected me to pull this off. I asked about getting expedited access, about pulling in support from other team members, about whether the deadline could be extended even slightly to make this remotely feasible. He waved off every concern like I was being dramatic. You'll figure it out, he said, already halfway out the door. That's what problem solving looks like. I have faith in you. Faith. Right. The kind of faith that comes with zero support and impossible expectations. I got to work anyway because what else was I going to do? I submitted every access request I needed that same day. I sent follow-up emails to department heads asking for expedited processing. I outlined exactly what I needed and why the timeline was so tight. I copied my boss on every single one of these emails, keeping him in the loop, documenting that I was doing everything possible to make this work. His responses were either non-existent or actively unhelpful. When I asked him to use his authority to push the access request through faster, he said he didn't want to step on toes in other departments. When I asked if he could at least reach out to confirm the requests were being prioritized, he told me I needed to take ownership of the project and handle it myself. I started getting suspicious around day 1 when I noticed he wasn't just unhelpful, he was strategically unhelpful. Every roadblock I hit, he had an excuse for why he couldn't assist. Every solution I proposed, he shot down without offering alternatives. It felt deliberate, so I started forwarding emails to my personal account. Not company secrets, not proprietary information, just the email chains that documented my requests, his responses, and the timeline of events. Call it paranoia, call it self-preservation, but something in my gut told me I was going to need these later. The 2 days passed exactly as you'd expect. I worked around the clock, got maybe 6 hours of sleep total, survived on coffee and stress, and managed to compile a partial report using only the data I could access without special permissions. It wasn't complete, it couldn't be complete. The information I needed was still locked behind access requests that hadn't been approved yet. Exactly as I'd warned would happen. Then came the breaking point. My boss scheduled a meeting with HR first thing Monday morning to discuss my performance issues. He didn't tell me what the meeting was about beforehand, just sent a calendar invite with HR's name on it and a subject line that said performance review. My stomach dropped the second I saw it. I walked into that conference room and immediately knew what was happening. My boss was already there, sitting across from 2 HR representatives, and he had this look on his face like he'd already won. He'd set this up. The impossible project, the blocked resources, the tight deadline. He'd engineered my failure so he'd have justification to either demote me or push me out entirely. He started the meeting by expressing his disappointment in my work. Said he'd given me a high visibility project, a chance to really shine and prove myself, and I'd delivered incomplete results. He made it sound like I'd been lazy, like I hadn't tried, like I'd just given up instead of rising to the challenge. The HR reps were taking notes, nodding along, asking me if I had anything to say in my defense. And honestly, if I hadn't saved those emails, I probably would have been screwed right there. It would have been his word against mine, and he was the one with the authority and the polished narrative. But I had receipts. I opened my laptop, pulled up the email folder I'd been compiling, and very calmly started walking through the timeline. I showed them the initial project assignment with the 2-day deadline. Then I showed them every single access request I'd submitted, all time-stamped and documented. I showed them my follow-up emails asking for support. I showed them the responses from other departments, explaining that access requests typically took 1 to 3 weeks to process. And then I showed them my boss's responses, or rather, his lack of responses. The emails where I'd specifically asked him to help expedite the approvals, and he'd refused. The messages where I'd outlined the exact problems I was facing, and he'd told me to figure it out myself. His face went pale, like actually lost color. He started to say something, stumbled over his words, then went quiet. One of the HR reps, a woman I'd seen around but never really talked to, looked at him and asked very directly why he'd assigned a project he knew couldn't be completed in the given time frame without providing the necessary resources or support. He stammered something about wanting to see how I handled pressure, about teaching me to be resourceful, about how he thought I'd find creative solutions. It was painful to watch him try to spin this. And here's where it gets absurd. I wasn't done, because while I was digging through those emails, I'd found something else, something I almost missed because it wasn't even sent to me directly. It was an email chain between my boss and another coworker, someone on his level, where he explicitly said he was setting me up to justify a termination. Actual words, setting her up to justify a termination. The coworker had forwarded it to me months ago as a heads up, and I'd saved it but honestly hadn't thought much of it at the time because it seemed too blatant to be real. But there it was, written evidence of premeditated sabotage. I pulled it up on the screen. The room went dead silent. The HR rep stared at the email, then at my boss, then back at the email. One of them asked him if this was real. He tried to claim it was taken out of context, that it was a joke, that I was misinterpreting the situation. Nobody was buying it. The meeting ended pretty abruptly after that. The HR rep said they needed to investigate further, and that my boss should probably not participate in any more discussions about my performance until this was resolved. He left the room looking like he'd just been hit by a truck. I went back to my desk, not really sure what to expect next. Part of me thought maybe they'd just sweep it under the rug, find some way to protect him because he'd been with the company longer and had more political capital. But I underestimated how much companies hate liability. He was placed on administrative leave that same afternoon. Pending investigation, they said. I kept working, kept my head down, and tried not to think about the fact that I'd just blown up my boss's career in a conference room with a PowerPoint presentation's worth of email evidence. 2 weeks later, he was gone. Just gone. No announcement, no farewell email. His name just disappeared from the employee directory, and his office was cleaned out. I heard through the grapevine that he'd been let go for creating a hostile work environment and for violating company policy around employee management. And then, about a month after that, I got called into another meeting with HR. This time, it was to offer me his position. Interim at first, they said, but with the strong possibility of it becoming permanent if I wanted it. I took the job, not because I especially wanted to be a manager, but because the alternative was staying in a role where I'd always wonder if the next person above me would try the same thing. At least this way, I had some control. The whole thing still feels surreal sometimes. The fact that he genuinely thought he could set me up to fail, and I just take it without question. The arrogance of putting his plan in writing. The sheer stupidity of underestimating someone he was actively trying to sabotage. I learned a lot from that experience. I learned to document everything. I learned that trust in the workplace is conditional, and that covering yourself isn't paranoia, it's survival. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge really is just giving someone enough rope to hang themselves and then handing HR the footage. Family betrayals hit different though, especially when money's involved and someone's playing the victim a little too convincingly. I got the call on a Tuesday night around 9 p.m., which should have been my first red flag because my brother and I weren't exactly the type to have heart-to-heart phone conversations. We were close enough, did the obligatory holiday gatherings, texted about sports occasionally, but we weren't calling each other in tears about our problems. So when his name popped up on my screen and I heard him sobbing on the other end, my stomach dropped. "I need help," he said, and his voice was shaking in that way that made it sound like his world was ending. "I'm in serious trouble." My mind immediately went to the worst places. Car accident, legal issues, someone hurt. I asked him what happened, trying to stay calm while my brain spiraled through every possible disaster scenario. He told me he had a medical emergency a few weeks back, had to go to the ER, and the bills had piled up faster than he could handle. He said the hospital was threatening to send his account to collections if he didn't pay $8,000 within the next few days. He said his credit was already barely hanging on, and if this went to collections, he'd be completely ruined. He said he'd tried everything, asked his friends, looked into payment plans, but nothing had worked, and I was his last option. I know it's a lot, he said, and I could hear him crying. I know I shouldn't be asking, but I don't have anyone else. I'll pay you back, I promise. I just need a little time. I had about $9,000 in savings. It was everything I'd managed to scrape together over the past 2 years. Money I'd been setting aside for emergencies. Maybe a down payment on a car eventually. Something that would actually improve my life. But this was my brother. Family. And he sounded desperate in a way I'd never heard before. I asked him if he'd talk to Mum and Dad. He said he couldn't, that they were already helping with other bills and he didn't want to burden them further. I asked him about payment plans with the hospital. He said he'd tried, but they wouldn't work with him because of his credit history. Every question I asked, he had an answer for, and every answer made the situation sound more urgent and more hopeless. I told him I'd send the money. The relief in his voice was overwhelming. He thanked me probably a dozen times, said he'd pay me back as soon as he could, said I was saving his life. I felt good about it, honestly, like I'd done something meaningful, helped someone I cared about when they really needed it. I transferred the money the next morning, $8,000 gone from my account in seconds. He texted me immediately, thanking me again, saying he'd never forget this. I told him not to worry about it, that family takes care of family, and we'd figure out a repayment plan whenever he was back on his feet. Weeks went by, then months. I didn't push him about the money because I figured he was dealing with enough stress already. And I didn't want to be that person who loans money and then immediately starts demanding it back. Whenever I saw him at family gatherings, he seemed fine. Not stressed, not struggling, just normal. I figured maybe things had stabilized for him, which was good. I was happy he was doing better. Then I saw the photos. He posted them on Instagram, a whole carousel of images from Hawaii. Beach shots, sunset photos, him holding some tropical drink with an umbrella in it, captions about much-needed vacation, and finally taking time for myself. The photos were dated from the week before, which meant this wasn't some old trip he was just now posting about. This was recent. This was happening right now, while I was still eating ramen twice a week to rebuild my savings after giving him $8,000. I stared at my phone for a solid 5 minutes, trying to make it make sense. Maybe someone else paid for the trip. Maybe he'd won it in some contest. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation that didn't involve him lying to me about a medical emergency so he could go on vacation. I texted him, kept it casual at first. Hawaii looks amazing, man. When did you plan that trip? His response came an hour later. Last minute thing, needed to clear my head. I asked how he could afford it if he was dealing with medical bills. The typing bubbles appeared and disappeared about 3 times before he finally responded with, "It was pretty cheap. Friend got a deal." That's when I knew. That weird gut feeling you get when someone's lying to you. Even through text, I could feel it. I called the hospital he'd named when he first asked for the money. I still had the name saved in my notes from our original conversation. I explained that I was trying to verify some billing information for my brother, gave them his name and approximate dates he would have been there. They had no record of him. Not in the ER, not as an inpatient, not anywhere in their system during the time frame he'd mentioned. I asked them to double check. They did. Nothing. I felt physically sick. That special kind of nausea that comes from realizing someone you trusted has completely betrayed you. I went through our text messages, took screenshots of everything. The original conversation where he asked for money, his promises to pay me back, his thanks afterward. I had it all documented. Then came the breaking point. I called him. He answered cheerfully, probably still riding the high from his vacation. I didn't ease into it. I asked him directly about the hospital records. The silence on the other end was deafening. Then he got defensive, said I had no right to call the hospital, that it was a violation of his privacy. I told him they had no record of him ever being there. He stumbled through some explanation about maybe it was a different hospital. Maybe he got the name wrong. Maybe their system was messed up. I asked him to send me the bills, any documentation at all. He said he didn't have them anymore, that he'd thrown them away after paying them. I asked him to request copies. He said he would, but then he never did. I confronted him with the vacation photos, asked him how he paid for Hawaii when he supposedly couldn't pay his medical bills. And that's when he finally broke. "Okay, fine," he said, and his voice had completely changed from defensive to annoyed. "There was no medical emergency. I needed a break from work and life and everything, and I knew you had money saved up. I figured you'd help me out if I asked nicely, and I was right. I was going to pay you back eventually." The casual way he said it, like it was no big deal that he'd fabricated an entire crisis to steal $8,000 from his own brother, made me want to throw my phone across the room. I told him he needed to pay me back immediately. He laughed. Actually laughed. Said he didn't have the money right now, that he'd spent it on the trip and some other things he needed, and I was being greedy by demanding it all back at once. He said I made good money and could afford to lose $8,000, so what was I even complaining about? I lost it. Told him exactly what I thought of him, what he'd done, how he'd betrayed my trust and stolen from me. He hung up on me. I sat there for a while, just processing the fact that my brother had looked me in the eye, lied about a medical emergency, took my savings, went on vacation with it, and then had the audacity to call me greedy for wanting my own money back. I told our parents the next day, showed them everything, the original messages, the hospital confirmation that he was never there, the vacation photos, the conversation where he admitted to lying. My mum cried. My dad got quiet in that scary way where you know he's furious but trying to keep it together. They called my brother immediately, demanded an explanation. He tried to downplay it at first, said it was between him and me and they shouldn't get involved. My mum shut that down fast, told him he'd lied and stolen from family and he needed to make it right. He called me a snitch, said I'd ruined his relationship with our parents by telling them, said I should have just handled it privately instead of running to mommy and daddy. My mum told him she expected him to start paying me back immediately, even if it was in small installments. He refused, said he didn't have the money and wasn't going to bankrupt himself to pay back a loan I'd given willingly. Family dinners became unbearable. The few times we were in the same room, the tension was suffocating. My parents tried to stay neutral, but my mum clearly sided with me, which made my brother even angrier. He'd make passive-aggressive comments, I'd ignore him, and eventually we just stopped talking altogether. It's been 2 years. He hasn't paid me back a single dollar. We don't speak. I see him occasionally at family events, and we pretend the other person doesn't exist. My parents have given up trying to mediate. My mum will mention him sometimes, say she wishes we could work it out, but I don't see that happening unless he pays me back and genuinely apologizes, and I don't think he's capable of either. The money's gone. I've accepted that. What's harder to accept is that my brother valued a vacation more than our relationship, and when caught, doubled down instead of trying to make things right. Some betrayals you can come back from, but this wasn't just about the money. It was about the calculated lie, the manipulation, the complete lack of remorse. I rebuilt my savings eventually. Took a while, but I got there. What I haven't rebuilt is any trust in him, and I don't think I ever will. You can't unknow something like this. You can't unsee who someone really is when they think they can get away with it. The whole thing taught me that sometimes family will hurt you worse than strangers ever could, because they know exactly which buttons to push and which lies you'll believe. Lies tend to unravel when someone's recording everything without telling you. And this next story, that's exactly what happened behind closed doors. I found it by accident. One of those moments where you're looking for the TV remote and end up discovering something that changes everything. I was digging between the couch cushions, hand wedged in that gap where everything disappears, and my fingers brushed against something small and rectangular. I pulled it out thinking it was maybe an old phone or a garage door opener we'd lost months ago. It was a voice recorder, one of those digital ones you can buy at any office supply store, small enough to hide almost anywhere, with a little red light that blinks when it's actively recording. My first thought was confusion. Why would we even own one of these? My second thought, the one that made my stomach drop, was why would it be hidden under the couch cushion, positioned perfectly to pick up conversations in our living room? I checked the device. It had hours of recordings saved on it. The most recent file was from 2 days ago. The date and timestamp matched perfectly with an argument we'd had about household chores. One of those stupid fights that escalates way beyond what it should because you're both tired and stressed and looking for an outlet. I sat there holding this thing, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation. Maybe they were recording themselves practicing a presentation for work. Maybe it was for a podcast idea they hadn't mentioned yet. Maybe it had been there for years and we'd both forgotten about it. But the timestamp said otherwise. These recordings were recent, deliberate, ongoing. When my partner got home that evening, I was sitting on the couch with the recorder on the coffee table in front of me. They saw it immediately, and their face did this thing where they tried to look confused but couldn't quite pull it off because they knew exactly what it was and exactly why I'd be upset about finding it. "Where did you get that?" they asked, which was a wild choice for an opening line considering it had been hidden in our shared furniture. I asked them directly why they'd been secretly recording me. Recording us. They hesitated, looked away, then finally admitted they'd been doing it for a few months. For evidence, they said, in case we ever broke up and things got messy. They wanted to have proof of what was really said during our arguments. The way they explained it, they made it sound almost reasonable, like they were just protecting themselves, documenting things for their own peace of mind. But the more I thought about it, the more twisted it felt. They'd been recording private conversations without my knowledge or consent. They'd been sitting across from me during some of our most vulnerable moments, knowing the whole time that everything I said was being captured and saved. I asked how long they'd been doing this. They said a few months, but they wouldn't give me an exact date. I asked if I could listen to the recordings. They refused immediately, said it was private, said I wouldn't understand the context. That refusal told me everything I needed to know. I didn't push it that night. We went to bed tense and silent, both of us pretending to sleep while clearly lying awake staring at the ceiling. I waited until they left for work the next morning, and then I went looking. Their laptop was password protected, but I knew the password. We'd always had an open device policy in our relationship, or at least I thought we did. Turns out privacy only went one direction. I found the folder pretty quickly. It was buried in their documents, labeled with something innocuous. But when I opened it, there they were. Audio files, dozens of them. Months' worth of recordings, all time-stamped, all labeled with brief descriptions of what each argument had been about. I started listening, and that's when everything unraveled. The recordings had been edited, not just trimmed for length, but deliberately cut to remove context. I'd hear myself getting frustrated or raising my voice, but the parts where my partner had said something cruel or dismissive first were just gone. Silent gaps where whole sentences should have been. It was me reacting to things that, in these edited versions, didn't exist. One recording in particular made me feel physically sick. It was from a fight we'd had about their family. In the edited version, it sounded like I was going off on an unprovoked rant about how much I hated their parents. But I remembered that argument. I remembered it clearly. What the recording didn't show was the 20 minutes before where they told me their mother had said I was a bad influence, and I'd responded by defending myself. The edited version made me sound unhinged. The reality was that I'd been hurt and trying to set boundaries. I copied everything. The whole folder, every single recording, edited and unedited when I could find both versions. I saved it all to a flash drive and then to a cloud account they didn't have access to. If they wanted evidence, I'd have my own. That evening, I told them I was done. I was moving out. We were over. They didn't argue at first, just nodded like they'd been expecting this. But then, as I started talking about logistics, about who would take what furniture, and how we'd split our shared belongings, they dropped the bomb. "I have recordings of you," they said, calm as anything. "If you try to make this difficult, or if you talk badly about me to our friends, I'll release them. I'll show everyone what you're really like." The threat hung in the air between us. They were going to use edited audio to paint me as abusive, as the villain in our relationship, unless I just quietly disappeared and let them control the narrative. I looked at them and realized I had no idea who this person was. The partner I'd loved, the person I'd built a life with, had been secretly recording me for months, editing those recordings to make me look bad, and was now threatening to use them as blackmail. It was like looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. I didn't tell them about the copies I'd made. I just said, okay, fine, whatever, and let them think they'd won. Over the next few days, I reached out to our mutual friends individually. People we'd known for years, people whose opinions mattered to both of us. I explained what had happened. I sent them the unedited recordings along with the edited versions, with clear timestamps showing where cuts had been made, what had been removed, how the context had been manipulated. The response was immediate and unanimous. Everyone was disgusted, not at me, at them. at the violation of privacy, at the manipulation, at the calculated way they'd been building a case against me while pretending everything was fine. My partner found out pretty quickly that their plan had backfired. Friends started confronting them, asking them what the hell they were thinking. They tried to backpedal hard, said the recordings were for therapy, that their therapist had suggested documenting our arguments to help process them. It was a last-ditch attempt to reframe the whole thing as mental health support instead of manipulation. No one believed them. Therapists don't tell you to secretly record your partner and then edit the recordings. That's not therapy. That's evidence tampering. Things went from bad to unhinged pretty quickly after that. They started sending me long emails, alternating between apologizing and blaming me for ruining their reputation. They said I'd turned everyone against them, that I was vindictive, that I'd taken something private and made it public just to hurt them. The irony of them complaining about privacy invasion was not lost on me. We broke up officially. I moved my stuff out over the course of a weekend while they stayed with a friend. We divided our belongings through terse text messages, neither of us willing to be in the same room anymore. The whole process felt mechanical and cold, which maybe was fitting for a relationship that had apparently been a surveillance operation for months. A few weeks later, I heard through mutual friends that they'd moved out of state. New job, fresh start, whatever narrative they were telling themselves to avoid accountability. I didn't ask for details and nobody volunteered them. They were just gone, and honestly, that was the best possible outcome. I still think about those recordings sometimes, wonder if they kept copies, if they still listen to them, if they've convinced themselves they were the victim in all of this. It's easier to believe your own edited version of events than to face the reality of what you've done. The whole experience taught me that trust, once broken in certain ways, doesn't heal. You can forgive a lot of things, mistakes, misunderstandings, even some betrayals if the person genuinely wants to make amends. But calculated deception over months, manipulation designed to destroy you if you ever tried to leave, that's not something you come back from. I'm more careful now. Pay attention to the small things that feel off. Trust my instincts when something doesn't add up. And I'll never, ever ignore that gut feeling that tells you someone's hiding something, because usually they are. Office politics can be just as ruthless, especially when someone thinks they've covered their tracks perfectly, until an audit digs up everything. I'd been working at the company for about 3 years when things started getting weird with my coworker, Angela. We weren't friends exactly, but we'd always been cordial. Same department, similar roles, occasionally grabbed coffee together when the workday dragged. Normal coworker stuff, but something shifted around the time I got recognized at a company meeting for landing a pretty big client. Nothing major, just a quick shout out and some applause, but I noticed her expression change when my name was called. It was brief, but it was there. A flash of something that looked a lot like resentment. A few weeks later, I started hearing whispers. Nothing direct, just that uncomfortable feeling you get when you walk into the break room and the conversation stops a little too abruptly. I brushed it off at first, figured I was being paranoid. But then a colleague I was friendly with pulled me aside and asked, very carefully, if everything was okay with my expense reports. I was confused. Of course, everything was okay. I submitted expenses like everyone else, kept my receipts, followed the company policy to the letter, because I'm honestly kind of paranoid about that stuff. I don't even expense coffee unless it's explicitly a client meeting. So I asked what she meant. She looked uncomfortable, said she'd heard some people were concerned about inconsistencies in my reports, and that maybe I should double-check everything just to be safe. She wouldn't say who'd brought it up, but I had a sinking feeling I already knew. 2 days later, I got called into a meeting with HR. My stomach dropped the second I saw the calendar invite. The subject line just said, expense report review, which is corporate speak for, you're in trouble and we're about to make it official. I walked into that meeting with my heart pounding, trying to project confidence I absolutely did not feel. There were 2 HR reps there, both with serious expressions and a folder that I assumed contained whatever evidence they thought they had against me. They told me there had been concerns raised about potential irregularities in my expense submissions. They were launching an audit of my reports from the past 18 months. They asked if I had anything I wanted to disclose up front, which is a trap question if I've ever heard one, because anything you say sounds like a confession even if you're innocent. I told them the truth. I'd followed policy exactly as written, kept all my receipts, and if there were any errors, they were honest mistakes that I'd be happy to correct. They nodded, took notes, and said the audit would take about a week. I left that meeting feeling like I was going to throw up. Even when you know you've done nothing wrong, being accused of something like expense fraud is terrifying. It's the kind of thing that can end your career even if you're cleared, because the suspicion alone sticks to you. I went through every expense report I'd ever submitted, checked receipts against entries, verified dates, made sure everything was categorized correctly. I found exactly 2 minor errors in 18 months. One where I'd accidentally listed a lunch as $15 instead of $14.50, and another where I'd transposed 2 digits in a hotel confirmation number. Trivial mistakes, nothing that even remotely suggested fraud. The week of waiting was torture. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep properly, kept imagining worst-case scenarios where somehow they'd find something I'd missed, and I'd lose everything over a mistake I didn't even know I'd made. But that wasn't even the worst part. About 5 days into the audit, I got another call from HR. They wanted to meet again, but this time the tone was different. Less accusatory, more official. When I walked in, there were more people in the room. Senior HR, someone from finance, and a guy I'd never seen before who turned out to be from the company's legal department. They told me the audit had expanded beyond just my reports. In the process of reviewing my expenses, they decided to audit the entire department as a standard precaution. And they'd found something. Not in my reports, in Angela's. Turns out Angela had been systematically inflating her expenses for at least 3 years. Fake receipts for dinners that never happened. Personal purchases labeled as business expenses. Hotels charged to the company for weekend trips that had nothing to do with work. The finance rep pulled up a spreadsheet that showed a pattern so obvious I couldn't believe nobody had caught it sooner. She'd been stealing from the company, and when she realized an audit might eventually catch up to her, she decided to preemptively throw me under the bus, frame me for expense fraud to create a distraction, make herself look like a concerned employee just looking out for company interests, and hope that any investigation would focus on me instead of her. It was calculated, it was deliberate, and it almost worked. The HR director asked me if I'd noticed anything unusual about Angela's behavior recently. I told them about the rumor mill, about the sudden coldness, about how she'd gone from friendly to distant right around the time I got that recognition at the company meeting. They took more notes. They told me I was completely cleared, that my reports were clean, and that they appreciated my cooperation. They also told me not to discuss the ongoing investigation with anyone, which meant I had to go back to my desk and pretend everything was normal, while knowing Angela's entire career was about to implode. And here's where it gets absurd. 2 days later, Angela didn't show up to work. Her desk was cleared out by the end of the week. I heard through the grapevine that HR had confronted her with the evidence, and she'd completely broken down. Admitted everything. Tried to justify it by saying she was under financial stress, that she had bills to pay, that she never meant for it to go on this long. She was fired immediately, not just fired, but asked to repay over $40,000 in fraudulent expenses. The company was pursuing every legal option to recover the money, which apparently included the possibility of criminal charges. I felt a weird mix of vindication and something that almost resembled pity. Almost. Because yeah, financial stress is real and it's hard, but she'd tried to destroy my career to cover her own crimes. She'd weaponized HR against me, spread rumors about my integrity, and put me through a week of absolute hell just to buy herself time. The pity didn't last long. She texted me a few days after she was fired. A long, rambling message about how sorry she was, how she never meant for things to go this far, how she was just scared and made bad decisions. Then she asked if I could put in a good word for her with HR, maybe tell them she was a good person who made mistakes, help her negotiate a better repayment plan. The audacity was genuinely impressive. She fought after everything she'd done, after trying to frame me for fraud, after putting my job and reputation at risk, that I'd advocate for her, that we'd somehow bond over shared workplace trauma, and I'd help her clean up the mess she'd made. I blocked her number without responding. Last I heard, the company did press charges. She's facing potential jail time depending on how the case goes, and even if she avoids that, she's got a massive debt and a permanent black mark on her record that'll make finding another job in this industry basically impossible. I still work at the same company, got a promotion about 6 months after all this went down, partly because of my work, but also, I think, because they felt guilty about putting me through the audit in the first place. My new manager has gone out of his way to make sure I feel valued, which is nice. But there's still this weird residual anxiety whenever I submit an expense report. I triple check everything now, keep digital and physical copies of every receipt, document every purchase like I'm preparing for trial. The whole thing taught me that sometimes people will burn your life down to keep their own secrets hidden, and the only thing that saves you is documentation and dumb luck. If that audit hadn't expanded to the whole department, if they'd only looked at my reports like Angela planned, I might have been the one getting fired while she continued stealing for who knows how long. It's the kind of close call that stays with you, makes you realize how fragile job security really is when someone decides you're a convenient scapegoat. Money ruins relationships faster than almost anything, especially when a family vacation nobody asked for becomes a guilt trip with receipts attached. The invitation came in our family group chat about 6 months before the actual trip. My aunt, who I'll call Linda, posted this long, heartfelt message about how our family had drifted apart over the years and how she wanted to bring everyone together for a proper reunion. She'd found this beautiful beach resort, she said, and she was treating everyone, all expenses paid, flights, rooms, meals, activities, everything. Her gift to the family because life was short and we needed to make memories together. It sounded amazing, honestly. Our family hadn't done anything like this in years, not since my grandmother passed away about 5 years earlier. Linda positioned herself as this generous benefactor who just wanted to see everyone happy and reconnected. People were touched. My mum cried when she read the message. My uncle called Linda personally to thank her for being so thoughtful. I was skeptical, but I couldn't really pinpoint why. Linda had never been particularly generous before. She wasn't struggling financially, but she also wasn't the type to drop tens of thousands of dollars on a family vacation out of the goodness of her heart. Still, everyone else was excited, and I didn't want to be the negative one, so I kept my thoughts to myself and said I'd be there. The resort was gorgeous, right on the ocean, beautiful rooms, incredible food, the kind of place you see in travel magazines and assume you'll never actually visit. There were about 20 of us total, spanning 3 generations, and for the first couple of days, it genuinely felt like the reunion Linda had promised. People were laughing, reconnecting, sharing stories. It was nice. Then midweek, Linda started shifting the vibe. It was subtle at first. Little comments during dinner about how much everything cost, how she'd really stretched herself to make this happen, how she hoped we all appreciated the sacrifice she'd made. People assured her we did, thanked her again, told her how wonderful the trip was, but she kept bringing it up, finding new ways to remind us that we were there because of her generosity. Then she started talking about her business. She'd gotten involved in some multi-level marketing thing, selling wellness products or supplements or something equally vague. She had samples with her, gave everyone little packets, started doing these informal presentations by the pool about the opportunity she wanted to share with us. People were polite but clearly uncomfortable. This was supposed to be a family vacation, not a sales pitch. But Linda was relentless, cornering relatives one by one, explaining how we could all get involved, how we owed it to ourselves to explore this opportunity. And, oh, by the way, since she'd been so generous with this trip, maybe we could show our appreciation by supporting her new venture. That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't about family bonding. This was a recruitment trip. She'd brought us all here, made us feel indebted to her, and now she was cashing in that social debt to build her downline. I started asking questions. How much had this trip actually cost? Where had the money come from? Linda had never mentioned having this kind of disposable income before, and now suddenly she could afford to fly 20 people to a beach resort for a week. She deflected every time I asked, said it wasn't important, that I should just enjoy the trip and stop being so suspicious. But the more she avoided the question, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. I went to the resort's front desk and asked to speak with someone about the billing for our group. I explained that I was part of the family staying there and wanted to understand how the payment had been structured. The manager was hesitant at first, said that information was private, but I pushed a little, explained that there might be some confusion about who actually paid, and I just needed clarification. He pulled up the account and told me the reservation had been paid for in full, in advance via a wire transfer from an estate account. My grandmother's estate account, the one Linda had told us was empty years ago, after debts and final expenses were settled. I felt my stomach drop. Our grandmother had left a decent inheritance, nothing life-changing, but enough that it should have been split among her children, including my mum. Linda had been the executor of the estate. She'd told everyone the money was gone, that Grandma's medical bills and funeral costs had eaten through everything, and we'd all believed her because why wouldn't we? Who lies about something like that? Apparently Linda does. I thanked the manager, went back to my room, and sat there for a while just processing what I'd learned. She'd stolen from the family. Kept our grandmother's money, let everyone believe it was gone, and then years later used it to fund a vacation designed to manipulate us into joining her pyramid scheme. The audacity was genuinely breathtaking. I confronted her that afternoon, away from everyone else. Told her I knew about the estate account, knew where the money for the trip had come from. I wanted to give her a chance to explain before I said anything to the rest of the family. She didn't even try to deny it. Just sighed, like I'd caught her doing something mildly annoying instead of committing what was essentially theft. She said yes, there had been money left over from Grandma's estate. She'd kept it because she was the executor, and she felt she deserved it for all the work she'd done handling everything. And she'd used some of it for this trip because she genuinely believed Grandma would have wanted the family to stay close and make memories together. I asked her if Grandma would have also wanted her to lie to her own siblings about their inheritance and then use the stolen money to recruit them into a scam. She got defensive then, said I didn't understand, that the business wasn't a scam, that she was trying to help everyone, that I was being ungrateful and cruel. She begged me not to tell anyone else, said it would destroy the family, ruin the trip, make everything fall apart. I told her she should have thought about that before she stole from us. That night at dinner, I told everyone. I laid out exactly what I discovered. The estate account, the money Linda had hidden, the fact that this entire trip was funded by an inheritance she'd claimed didn't exist. I showed them the documentation the resort had given me, the wire transfer details, everything. And suddenly, the whole plan fell apart. My mum started crying immediately. Not sad crying, angry crying. The kind where you're so hurt and betrayed that your body doesn't know what else to do. My uncle demanded that Linda produce full financial records from the estate right then and there. Other relatives started shouting, asking how she could do this, how long she'd been lying, what else she'd hidden. Linda screamed that I'd ruined everything, that I was vindictive and hateful, that I'd destroyed what was supposed to be a beautiful family moment. She tried to spin it as me being jealous or petty, but nobody was buying it. The evidence was too clear. Half the family left the resort early, just packed up and booked flights home because they couldn't stand to be there anymore. The ones who stayed did so mainly because changing flights was expensive and complicated, but the reunion atmosphere was completely dead. People barely spoke to each other. Meals were silent and awkward. My mum was devastated in a way I'd never seen before. That money would have helped her. She'd been struggling financially for years, and knowing that her own sister had stolen her inheritance and then used it for this manipulative vacation broke something in her. My uncle hired a lawyer as soon as we got home. Linda was forced to produce records from the estate, and it turned out the beach trip wasn't even the only thing she'd used the money for. She'd been living off it for years, funding her lifestyle while telling everyone she was just good at budgeting. The family collectively decided to exclude her from any future inheritance considerations. My mum's other siblings have wills now that explicitly state Linda gets nothing because of what she did with Grandma's estate. It's harsh, but I can't say it's undeserved. Linda and I haven't spoken since that night at the resort. She's tried a few times to reach out, sent messages saying I took things too far, that I should have handled it privately, that I destroyed the family over money, but she still hasn't actually apologized for what she did, just for how it turned out. The worst part is that she genuinely seems to believe she was the victim in all of this, that I betrayed her by exposing the truth instead of protecting her lie. It's wild how some people can rewrite reality in their own heads to avoid accepting responsibility. Our family hasn't recovered. We don't do reunions anymore. Holidays are fractured, with people choosing sides about whether Linda should be included or forgiven. My mum barely speaks to her. Some relatives think I should have kept quiet to preserve family harmony, but I don't regret it. Linda stole from us, lied about it for years, and then tried to manipulate us into funding her business. Someone had to say something. Social media makes things worse, obviously, especially when someone's playing the victim online and you've got the deleted posts that tell the real story. I woke up to 17 messages from people I hadn't talked to in months, all asking variations of the same question. Are you okay? What happened? I had no idea what they were talking about until someone finally sent me a link to my best friend's Twitter thread. She'd written this long, emotional post about how I'd completely abandoned her during the worst mental health crisis of her life, how she'd reached out for help over and over, and I'd ghosted her, how I'd proven that our friendship meant nothing the moment things got hard, how I was a fake friend who only stuck around when it was convenient. The thread had hundreds of likes and retweets. People were commenting with support for her, calling me terrible things, saying they couldn't believe someone could be so cruel. I sat there reading it, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach because none of it was true, not even remotely close to what had actually happened. For context, we'd been best friends for almost 6 years. The kind of friendship where you talk every day, know each other's families, have a decade's worth of inside jokes, but over the past several months she'd started pulling away. She'd cancel plans last minute, leave me on read for days, give one-word responses when she did reply. I figured she was going through something and needed space, so I gave it to her while still checking in regularly. I have screenshots of those check-ins, dozens of them, messages asking if she was okay, if she wanted to talk, if there was anything I could do to help, offers to bring her food, to just sit with her if she didn't want to be alone, to listen if she needed to vent. Most of them went unanswered. The ones that got responses were brief and dismissive. I'm fine, just busy, talk later. I kept trying anyway because that's what you do for someone you care about. You don't give up just because they're not responding the way you hope they will. You keep showing up. Then one day, out of nowhere, she blocked me on everything. Instagram, Twitter, messaging apps, even my phone number. No explanation, no warning, just suddenly cut off from someone who'd been a constant presence in my life for years. I was confused and hurt, but I figured maybe she needed a clean break from everything and everyone while she worked through whatever she was dealing with. I asked a mutual friend to let her know I was here if she ever wanted to talk. The mutual friend said she would pass it along. That was 3 months ago, and now here she was, publicly dragging me as the villain in her story, claiming I'd abandoned her when the truth was she'd systematically cut me out of her life and ignored every attempt I made to help. But that wasn't even the worst part. I started digging through my own screenshot folder, the one where I save important conversations just in case I need to reference them later, and I found something I'd almost forgotten about. Messages she'd posted in a group chat with other friends, messages where she was actively mocking me, making fun of things I'd told her in confidence, calling me clingy for checking in on her, laughing about how I couldn't take a hint that she didn't want to be friends anymore. She'd posted those messages about 2 months ago. Then she'd deleted them, probably hoping no one had saved them. But someone had. Someone had sent them to me at the time because they thought I should know what was being said behind my back. I'd been devastated when I first saw those messages. It's one thing to drift apart from a friend naturally. It's another thing entirely to find out they've been ridiculing you to other people while you're actively trying to support them. I tried reaching out to her privately first. I didn't want to make this a public thing. I sent her an email, the only method of contact I had left since she blocked everything else. I explained calmly that her thread wasn't accurate, that I had proof I'd tried to help repeatedly, and that I wished she'd talk to me directly instead of posting about it online. I said I still cared about her and wanted to understand what was really going on. Her response came 2 hours later, and it was venomous. She accused me of gaslighting her, of trying to rewrite history, of being exactly the kind of toxic person she'd described in her thread. She said my memory of events was wrong and that I was trying to manipulate her by pretending I'd been supportive when I clearly hadn't been. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I had literal evidence, time-stamped messages proving every single thing I'd said, and she was calling me a liar and a manipulator. That's when I realized this wasn't about the truth. This was about her needing a narrative where she was the victim and I was the villain, and no amount of facts or evidence was going to change that narrative in her mind. So I made a decision I didn't take lightly. I created my own thread. I kept it calm, factual, and as kind as possible given the circumstances. I explained that I was addressing the accusations because they were being spread publicly and were affecting my relationships with mutual friends. I posted screenshots of my messages to her, checking in, offering help, asking if she was okay. I blurred out anything too personal, kept timestamps visible, and let the images speak for themselves. I included the messages where she'd ignored me, the ones where she'd given dismissive responses, and yes, I included the screenshots of her mocking me in the group chat. I didn't attack her. I didn't call her names or speculate about her mental state. I just presented the facts and said that while I understood she was going through a difficult time, it wasn't fair or accurate to publicly blame me for abandoning her when I'd done the opposite. The response was immediate. People started questioning her story. Friends who'd believed her thread initially reached out to apologize for jumping to conclusions. A few people who'd been in that group chat confirmed that the screenshots I'd posted were real and unaltered. And here's where it gets absurd. Instead of acknowledging any of this or trying to have an actual conversation, she doubled down in the worst possible way. She claimed I'd doctored the images, said I'd used Photoshop or some app to fake the timestamps and conversations, said I was so obsessed with destroying her that I'd fabricated evidence. It was such an obviously desperate move that it actually hurt her credibility more than anything I could have said. People started pointing out that her story kept changing, that she'd deleted her original mocking messages, which made it look like she had something to hide, that her accusation of doctored images didn't make sense when multiple people could verify the conversations had happened. Within 24 hours, she'd deleted her entire thread. Then she deleted her Twitter account, then her Instagram, just completely vanished from social media. Our mutual friends were in this weird position where they didn't know what to say or do. A few of them reached out to me privately to apologize for believing her initial story without asking for my side. They said they felt manipulated, that they'd been used as pawns in whatever was going on with her, and they were sorry for contributing to the pile-on against me. I appreciated the apologies, but the whole situation left me feeling hollow. This was someone I'd genuinely cared about, someone I'd considered one of my closest friends, and she'd not only cut me out of her life, but tried to destroy my reputation on the way out. For what? Because she needed someone to blame for her own struggles? Because it was easier to paint me as the bad guy than to acknowledge she'd pushed people away? I never heard from her again. Not an apology, not an explanation, nothing. She just disappeared, moved on, presumably found new people to surround herself with who didn't know this version of events. The experience taught me something uncomfortable about friendships and about people in general. Sometimes the person who claims to be the victim the loudest is the one doing the most damage. Sometimes people will rewrite entire histories to avoid taking responsibility for their own actions. And sometimes, no matter how much evidence you have, no matter how clearly you can prove what really happened, the other person will never admit they were wrong, because admitting it would shatter the story they've built about themselves. I'm more careful now about who I trust with my time and energy. I still try to be there for people, still offer support when I can, but I'm also more aware of the signs that someone is pulling away for reasons that have nothing to do with needing space and everything to do with needing a scapegoat. The whole thing still stings sometimes, not because I miss her exactly, but because I miss who I thought she was. The friend I believed I had versus the person she actually turned out to be. Those are two very different people, and grieving that gap is harder than grieving the friendship itself. Workplace accusations are brutal, especially when you're innocent and someone's counting on chaos to bury the truth. But security logs don't lie. I walked into work on a Wednesday morning and immediately knew something was off. The energy in the office felt wrong, tense in that way where you can tell people have been talking about something, but stop the second you appear. I grabbed coffee, settled at my desk, and tried to ignore the weird looks I was getting from coworkers. Around 10 a.m., my manager called an impromptu team meeting. Everyone filed into the conference room looking uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with me specifically, which made my stomach start doing flips. My manager stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed, and before anyone even sat down, he started talking. A company laptop had gone missing from the secure equipment room. High-end device loaded with proprietary software and client data. The kind of thing that's not just expensive, but a genuine security risk if it ends up in the wrong hands. He said the laptop had last been logged in the inventory system yesterday afternoon, and according to access records, I was the only person who'd entered that room during the relevant time frame. He didn't ask if I knew anything about it. He didn't suggest there might be a misunderstanding. He just looked directly at me in front of the entire team and said I was the only one with access, so I needed to explain what happened to the laptop. The room went completely silent. Everyone was staring at me. I could feel my face getting hot. That awful combination of embarrassment and anger that comes from being publicly accused of something you didn't do. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. Yes, I'd been in the equipment room yesterday to grab a replacement mouse, but I hadn't touched any laptops. I'd been in there maybe 3 minutes, grabbed what I needed from the supply shelf, and left. I didn't even go near the laptop storage area. He said the logs didn't lie, and I was the only entry recorded. He said this was a serious matter, that theft of company property could result in termination and potentially legal consequences, and I needed to come clean now before this got worse. I felt like I was going to throw up. Being accused of theft in front of your entire team is humiliating in a way that's hard to describe. Even if you're innocent, even if you know you didn't do anything wrong, there's this immediate assumption of guilt that hangs in the air. People start looking at you differently, wondering if maybe there's something they don't know about you. I said again that I didn't take the laptop, that I'd only been in there briefly, and that if he thought I was lying, he should check the security cameras or pull more detailed access logs, because I had absolutely nothing to hide. He dismissed the meeting after that, but told me HR would be in touch, and I should prepare to provide a full account of my movements yesterday. I went back to my desk feeling like everyone was watching me, judging me, already deciding I was guilty. HR called me in that afternoon, 2 representatives, both with serious expressions and notepads. They asked me to walk them through my entire day yesterday, every time I'd left my desk, everywhere I'd gone, everyone I'd talked to. I gave them everything, minute by minute, including the 3 minutes I'd spent in the equipment room grabbing a mouse. I told them explicitly that I wanted them to check the security logs, pull the camera footage, do whatever they needed to do to verify my story, because I knew I hadn't taken anything. One of the HR reps said they'd look into it, but I could tell from her tone she was just humoring me. They'd already decided I was the likely culprit, because the access logs supposedly pointed to me. That night I barely slept, kept replaying the accusation in my head, imagining worst-case scenarios where somehow I'd be blamed for this, even though I was innocent. Thought about how hard it would be to find another job with a theft accusation on my record, even if I was never formally charged. The next day, I went back to HR first thing, told them I wasn't leaving until they pulled those security logs and camera footage. I was polite but firm. If they were going to accuse me of stealing company property, they needed to actually investigate, instead of just assuming the access logs told the whole story. They finally agreed, said they'd pull the records and review the footage from the equipment room. I went back to my desk to wait, trying to focus on work while my career potentially hung in the balance. This is where patience finally snapped. About 2 hours later, I got called back to HR. This time, the energy in the room was completely different. The 2 reps looked uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact. They told me they'd pulled the complete access logs, not just the summary report my manager had referenced. Turns out I wasn't the only person who'd accessed that room yesterday. My manager had entered it as well, about an hour after I'd left, and according to the timestamps, the laptop had disappeared during his access window, not mine. They'd pulled the camera footage too, grainy security camera quality, but clear enough to see me entering the room, going directly to the supply shelf, grabbing a mouse, and leaving without going anywhere near the laptop storage. Then, an hour later, my manager entering, going straight to the laptop storage area, removing a device and leaving with it tucked under his arm. The HR reps asked me if I'd had any conflicts with my manager recently. I said no, nothing specific, though he'd seemed annoyed when I'd pushed back on some unrealistic deadlines a few weeks earlier. Nothing that would explain this level of retaliation, though. They thanked me for my patience and said they'd be in touch. I left that meeting feeling vindicated, but also deeply unsettled because my manager had actively tried to frame me for theft. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. He'd taken the laptop himself and then publicly blamed me, knowing I could lose my job over it. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. HR moved fast once they had the evidence. My manager was called in that same afternoon. I wasn't present for that conversation, but I heard later from someone in HR who leaked the details that he'd immediately gone into defensive mode. Said he'd taken the laptop for safekeeping because he was concerned about security in the equipment room. Said he was planning to return it but had forgotten it was in his car. Said the whole thing was a misunderstanding and he'd meant to tell someone, but it had slipped his mind. Conveniently, none of that explained why his first instinct had been to publicly accuse me of the theft, instead of mentioning that he'd removed the laptop himself. HR didn't buy it. They fired him that day, walked him out of the building immediately, didn't even let him go back to his desk to collect his personal items. They'd pack it up and mail it to him. Standard protocol for terminations involving suspected theft or fraud. I got called into HR again the following morning. They apologized formally for the accusation, said they should have pulled the complete logs from the beginning instead of relying on the summary report my manager had provided. They offered me his position on an interim basis, said they were impressed with how I'd handled the situation and wanted to make things right. I took the position, partly because it came with a significant raise, but mostly because I wanted to prove that his attempt to destroy my reputation had failed, that I was still standing and he wasn't. The team meeting where they announced his termination and my promotion was awkward. Nobody mentioned why he was gone, just that there had been a management change and I'd be stepping into the role temporarily. But word gets around in offices. People figured out pretty quickly that he'd tried to frame me, and it had backfired spectacularly. Some co-workers apologized for how they'd treated me during those couple of days when everyone thought I was a thief. Others just pretended nothing had happened, which was almost worse. A few people asked what actually went down, and I gave them the basic facts without editorializing. Let the story speak for itself. My former manager tried reaching out a few weeks later through LinkedIn. Sent me this long message about how the situation had been blown out of proportion, how he'd made a mistake but didn't deserve to lose his career over it, how he hoped I understood it wasn't personal. He asked if I'd be willing to provide a reference for his job search, said it would really help if someone from the company could vouch for him. The sheer nerve of asking me to help him after he'd tried to destroy my career was almost impressive in its delusion. I didn't respond, just deleted the message and blocked him. He was never allowed back on company property. Security had his photo flagged in their system as a former employee terminated for cause. I saw him once in a coffee shop months later, and he tried to approach me, but I just walked past like he didn't exist. The whole experience taught me that documentation and evidence matter more than anything when someone's trying to scapegoat you. If I hadn't pushed HR to check those logs and pull that footage, I might have been the one fired while he kept his job. Persistence saved me, and his arrogance destroyed him. Relationships fall apart when timelines don't add up. And when you've got a receipt that puts someone in a completely different place than they said they were, game over. My fiancé told me he'd worked late on a Thursday and gone straight home afterward. Nothing unusual about that. He had a demanding job and late nights happen pretty regularly. I didn't think much of it at the time because I trusted him and had no reason not to. Except that same Thursday, I'd driven past his office building around 8 p.m. on my way back from my sister's place. His car wasn't in the parking lot, not in his usual spot, not in the overflow area, nowhere. The lot was pretty empty at that hour, so it would have been hard to miss. I didn't say anything. I told myself there were a dozen explanations. Maybe he'd parked somewhere else. Maybe he'd gone to grab food and I just missed him. Maybe he'd carpooled with a coworker. I wasn't going to be that person who interrogated their partner over something that probably meant nothing. But the details stuck in my mind, this little splinter I couldn't quite ignore. The next day, Friday, he mentioned during dinner that he'd worked late again the night before and just had a quiet evening at home. Ordered some food, watched TV, nothing exciting. He said it casually, the way you mention any mundane detail about your day. I was doing laundry that weekend and found a receipt in his jacket pocket. Not snooping, just emptying pockets before throwing things in the wash like I always did. It was from a restaurant downtown, a nice Italian place we'd been to once for an anniversary. The receipt was from Thursday night, time-stamped at 7:45 p.m. 2 entrees, 2 drinks, an appetizer. Definitely not a solo meal. My stomach did this uncomfortable flip. I sat there on the edge of the bed holding this receipt, trying to make it make sense with what he'd told me. He'd said he worked late and went straight home. He'd said he had dinner alone, but here was proof he'd been at a restaurant with someone during the exact time he claimed to be working. I decided to ask him about it calmly. No accusations, no drama, just a simple question to clear up what was probably a misunderstanding. That evening, I showed him the receipt and asked who he'd had dinner with. The change in his expression was immediate. He went from relaxed to defensive in about half a second. He said a coworker had joined him last minute, that he'd forgotten to mention it because it wasn't important. Just grabbed a quick bite with someone from work, no big deal. I asked who. It was a fair question. We knew each other's coworkers, talked about work stuff all the time. If he'd had dinner with someone from his office, he should be able to just tell me who without hesitation. He hesitated, for just a beat, too long. Then he said Sarah, one of the project managers he worked with occasionally. I knew Sarah. We'd met at a couple of company events. She seemed nice enough, and I had no reason to suspect anything between them. But something about the way he'd said her name, the slight pause before he answered, made me want to verify. I checked Sarah's Instagram that night. She'd posted stories throughout the week, including several from Thursday when she was very clearly out of town at a conference in Denver. Time-stamped photos of her at panels, having drinks with other attendees, the convention center in the background. She definitely hadn't been having dinner with my fiancé in our city on Thursday night. I felt sick, not just because he'd lied, but because he'd lied so easily, so quickly, without even seeming to think about it, and he'd look me right in the eye while doing it. I confronted him the next morning, laid out everything calmly, his car not being at work when he said he was there, the restaurant receipt for 2 people when he claimed to have eaten alone at home, the lie about Sarah when she was provably in another state. I didn't yell, didn't cry, just presented the facts and asked him to explain. That's when everything unraveled. He broke almost immediately. The defensiveness crumbled and he admitted he'd been seeing his ex. Just as friends, he insisted, nothing physical, just grabbing dinner occasionally and catching up. He said it had started a few months ago when she'd reached out saying she wanted closure on how things ended between them. He'd agreed to meet her once, and then once turned into multiple times, and he knew I wouldn't be comfortable with it, so he just didn't mention it. I asked him how many times. He said he wasn't sure, maybe 5 or 6 dinners over the past 3 months. I asked if there had been other lies, other times he told me he was working late or meeting up with guys from the office when he was really with her. He admitted there were, said he'd hidden it because he knew how it would look, but that it really was innocent. They were just talking, working through old issues, and it didn't mean anything. The thing is, even if I believed it was platonic, which I didn't, the lying was enough. He'd spent 3 months deliberately deceiving me, creating fake timelines, making up cover stories, looking me in the eye and telling me he'd been places he hadn't been, with people he hadn't been with. That level of calculated dishonesty doesn't happen by accident. It requires constant, active effort to maintain. I told him the engagement was off. He immediately started begging, saying he'd made a mistake, that he'd cut contact with his ex completely, that this wasn't worth losing what we had. He swore nothing physical had happened, like that somehow made the betrayal less significant. But I didn't care whether they'd hooked up or not. The issue wasn't just about his ex. It was about his willingness to lie to my face repeatedly, about his ability to compartmentalize his life in a way that let him have secret dinners with another woman while planning a future with me, about the fact that if I hadn't found that receipt, he would have kept lying indefinitely. I moved out 2 weeks later, stayed with a friend while I found my own place, which was easier than I expected because my name wasn't on the lease. The logistics were messy but manageable. The emotional part was harder. He texted constantly at first, long messages about how sorry he was, how he'd messed up the best thing in his life, how he wanted to prove he could change. I didn't respond to any of them. What was there to say? He'd already shown me exactly who he was when he thought he could get away with it. The texts have slowed down over time, but they still come occasionally. Usually late at night, usually when he's probably been drinking. I never respond. I don't block him because part of me wants to know if he tries to contact me. But I have no interest in engaging. Some mutual friends tried to play mediator early on, suggesting we could work through it with counseling, or that I was being too harsh. But none of them had sat where I sat, holding evidence of repeated, calculated lies, watching someone they loved scramble for excuses. They didn't have to experience that specific flavor of betrayal where you realize the person you were planning to marry had been living a double life right in front of you. The whole thing taught me to trust my instincts. That night when I drove past his office and his car wasn't there, something in my gut said something was off. I'd tried to rationalize it away, tried to be the cool, trusting girlfriend who didn't question every little thing. But my instincts were right. They'd been trying to tell me something was wrong, and I should have listened sooner. I'm doing better now. Got my own apartment, refocused on work and friendships I'd maybe neglected a bit during the relationship. Started therapy to work through some of the trust issues this whole situation created. It's a process, but I'm getting there. Looking back, I'm glad I found out before the wedding. Glad I didn't legally tie myself to someone who could lie that smoothly and that often. The engagement ring is in a drawer somewhere. I'll probably sell it eventually, but for now it just sits there. An expensive reminder that sometimes the life you're planning isn't built on the foundation you thought it was. Siblings can betray you just as badly, especially when they've been hiding something for years and think they can call you the liar when it finally comes out. We were halfway through Thanksgiving dinner when my sister decided to publicly humiliate me in front of the entire family. Everyone was there: aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, the whole extended group crammed around my parents' dining room table. I'd been telling a story about something that happened when we were kids, nothing scandalous, just a funny memory about a camping trip where we'd gotten lost on a hiking trail for about an hour before Dad found us. My sister interrupted me mid-sentence and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that I was making things up again, that I had this habit of inventing dramatic stories about our childhood to get attention. She said it with this condescending smile, like she was gently correcting a child who didn't know better, and half the table laughed uncomfortably because they didn't know if she was joking or serious. I stared at her, genuinely stunned. The camping story was completely true. She'd been there. She knew it happened, but she was sitting across from me, telling everyone I was a liar and watching me try to defend myself like it was entertaining. She kept going, said I'd always been dramatic, always exaggerated things, that half the stories I told about our childhood were either totally made up or so twisted from reality they barely resembled what actually happened. She said it so confidently that I could see people around the table starting to question whether my memories were reliable. This wasn't the first time she'd done this. For years, she'd been subtly gaslighting me about shared experiences. I'd bring up something we'd done together, and she'd claim it never happened or happened completely differently. At first, I thought maybe I was misremembering things, but it kept happening, always in front of other people, always positioned to make me look unreliable or attention-seeking. Something in me snapped. I was so tired of being called a liar, so tired of her rewriting our history to suit whatever narrative made her look better. So I said something I'd kept quiet about for years. You mean like how you stole $3,000 from Mum's account and blamed it on her ex-boyfriend? The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a fork drop 3 rooms away. Everyone just stopped, mid-conversation, mid-bite, and stared at us. My sister went pale, like actually lost color in her face. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. My mum, who'd been in the kitchen getting more food, came back into the dining room and immediately picked up on the tension. She asked what was going on, looking between me and my sister with this confused, concerned expression. I told her. Told everyone, actually, since we were apparently doing public revelations now. Explained that about 6 years ago, I'd found bank statements in some old paperwork my mum had asked me to organize. Transfers from her savings account that she'd never made, all going to an account in my sister's name. $3,000 total, moved over the course of 2 months. At the time, my mum had been dating this guy, who turned out to be bad news in a lot of ways. When she discovered the missing money, she'd assumed he'd somehow gotten access to her account and stolen it. She'd broken up with him partially because of that, and he'd never been able to prove his innocence because he didn't have proof he hadn't done it. I'd found those statements years after the breakup, long after the ex-boyfriend was out of the picture. I'd confronted my sister privately back then, and she'd begged me not to tell Mum. She said she'd been young and stupid, that she'd needed the money for rent and hadn't known how else to ask, that she'd planned to pay it back but never managed to. She promised she'd tell Mom herself eventually, when the time was right. I'd kept her secret to keep the peace, to avoid blowing up the family, to give her the chance to come clean on her own terms like she'd promised. But she never did, and now here she was, calling me a liar in front of everyone, betting on the fact that I'd stay quiet to protect her. Not anymore. My mum demanded an explanation. her voice shaking in that way that meant she was trying very hard not to lose it in front of the whole family. My sister tried to deny it at first, said I was lying out of spite, that I'd made up this whole story to get back at her for calling me out. But I had the bank statements. I'd kept copies, saved them in a folder on my laptop just in case. I pulled them up on my phone right there at the table and showed my mum. Dates, amounts, account numbers, everything clearly documented. And here's where it gets absurd. My sister completely crumbled, started crying, saying yes, okay. She'd taken the money, but she'd been in a terrible place financially and didn't know what else to do. She said she was young and stupid, which was the exact same excuse she'd used when I'd confronted her privately 6 years ago. She begged Mum to understand, said she'd wanted to tell her but was too ashamed, that she'd been planning to pay it back, but life kept getting in the way. My mum was devastated, not just about the money, but about the fact that my sister had let her blame an innocent person for years. The ex-boyfriend might have been problematic in other ways, but he hadn't stolen from her, and his reputation had been destroyed partially based on an accusation that was completely false. My sister, still crying, turned on me, screamed that I was vindictive and cruel for bringing this up now, at Thanksgiving, in front of everyone, that I'd kept it secret for years and only revealed it to hurt her, that I was using her past mistakes as a weapon just because she'd called me out for exaggerating stories. I looked at her and said very calmly that I was tired of being called a liar, that she'd spent years gaslighting me, undermining my credibility, making me doubt my own memories, all while sitting on a secret way worse than anything she'd accused me of, that if she wanted to play the game of public accusations and humiliation, she should have made sure her own past was clean first. The rest of dinner was a disaster. Half the family left early. The ones who stayed were divided between people who thought I'd been right to expose the truth and people who thought I should have kept it private regardless of what my sister had said to me. My mum couldn't even look at my sister for the rest of the night. Things went from bad to unhinged over the following weeks. My sister sent me pages-long texts about how I'd destroyed her relationship with Mum, how I was a terrible person, how she'd never forgive me. She told other family members her version of events, where she was the victim of my vindictive personality and I'd used an old mistake to ruin her life. Some relatives bought it, others asked for my side and realized she'd been manipulating situations for years. The family essentially split into factions. My mom and sister eventually had multiple long conversations about the money and the lies. My sister did pay her back, though it took over a year. Their relationship is still strained, not quite broken, but definitely damaged in ways that might never fully heal. My sister and I barely speak now. When we're forced to be in the same place for family events, we're coldly polite and avoid direct interaction. She still maintains I was wrong to expose her secret publicly, that it was a private matter I weaponized. I maintain that she spent years calling me a liar and gaslit me about our shared history, so she doesn't get to complain about truth-telling. The whole thing taught me that sometimes keeping the peace means letting people walk all over you, and that some secrets are only kept because the person who knows them is too kind or too conflict-averse to speak up. But when that person finally does speak up, the fallout is on the person who created the lie, not the person who revealed it. Credit theft is one thing, but when your manager literally steals your work and builds a fake career on lies, that's a whole different level of audacity that deserves exposure. I'd been working on this project for months. Market analysis, client outreach, building a whole new framework for how our department could streamline operations and increase revenue. It was the kind of project that doesn't come around often, the kind that could actually make a difference to your career if it went well. I'd put in late nights, weekends, pulled together data from a dozen different sources, and created something I was genuinely proud of. The presentation to the executive team was scheduled for a Thursday morning. My manager told me he wanted to be there to support me, to help field questions if the execs pushed back on any of the recommendations. I thought that was reasonable. He was my manager. It made sense for him to be in the room. What I didn't expect was for him to take over the presentation entirely. I walked into that conference room with my laptop, my notes, ready to present the work I'd done. The executives filed in, grabbed coffee, settled into their seats. My manager stood up, smiled, and started talking. He pulled up my slides on the main screen and began presenting my project as if he'd created it himself. He used the word I constantly. I identified this market gap. I developed this framework. I believe this approach will increase revenue by 15%. Every single idea I'd spent months developing, he claimed as his own. I sat there completely frozen, trying to process what was happening, trying to figure out if maybe I'd misunderstood the plan, if maybe this was some kind of test or teaching moment that I wasn't getting. But no, he was just stealing my work right in front of me, in front of the people who had the power to advance my career. The executives loved it, asked smart questions, which he answered using the research I'd done. They praised his initiative, his innovative thinking, his strategic vision. At the end of the presentation, the CFO actually shook his hand and said this was exactly the kind of leadership the company needed. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My manager caught up with me in the hallway, put his hand on my shoulder, and said I'd done a great job with the supporting research. Supporting research, like I'd been his assistant instead of the person who'd created the entire thing from scratch. He got a bonus 2 weeks later, $5,000 for the project. Then, a month after that, a promotion to senior manager, all based on work I'd done, ideas I'd had, analysis I'd compiled. I was furious in a way I'd never been before. Not just angry, but that specific kind of rage that comes from being completely powerless while watching someone else benefit from your effort. I couldn't just go to the executives and say, actually, that was my project, because it would look like sour grapes or like I was trying to undermine my manager. I'd have no credibility, and it would probably end my career at the company faster than his theft had advanced his. So I started digging into his background instead. His resume was posted on the company's internal directory, the version he'd submitted when he applied for his current role 3 years ago. It listed 2 master's degrees, one in business administration from a well-known university, and another in data analytics from a smaller but respected school. It also claimed several professional certifications in project management and business strategy. I started verifying, called the registrar's office at the first university, said I was doing a background check and needed to confirm degree completion for someone who'd listed them as an alumnus. They searched their records. No one by his name had ever graduated with an MBA from that institution. I tried the second university. Same result. No record of him completing any graduate program there. The certifications were easier to check because most of them have public databases. I searched for his name in every registry he'd claimed credentials from. Nothing. He'd listed certifications he'd never earned from organizations he'd apparently never joined. My manager had built his entire career on fake credentials, and he'd been promoted repeatedly, given authority over people like me, based on qualifications he didn't actually have. But that wasn't even the worst part. I started going through my email archives, looking for other instances where he might have taken credit for work that wasn't his. I found dozens of examples, reports I'd written that he'd forwarded to senior leadership with his name on them, analysis I'd compiled that he'd presented in meetings as his own insights. There was even one case where he'd copied one of my emails word for word, changed the signature to his name, and sent it to the executive team as if he'd written it himself. I compiled everything into a single document. Screenshots of his resume with the false credentials highlighted. Confirmation letters from the universities stating they had no record of him. Screenshots from the certification databases showing no registration under his name. Side-by-side comparisons of my emails and his plagiarized versions. The original files from my project with timestamps showing I'd created them, next to the presentation he'd given taking credit for everything. It was about 40 pages of evidence by the time I finished. Comprehensive, documented, impossible to dismiss as a misunderstanding or miscommunication. I sent it anonymously to HR and to 3 members of the executive team, including the CFO who'd praised his innovative thinking. Used a burner email account, kept the message brief and professional. Just said that information had come to light regarding falsified credentials and plagiarism and attached the documentation. The response was immediate. HR launched a formal investigation the next day. My manager was pulled into meetings, asked to provide proof of his degrees and certifications. He apparently tried to claim there had been misunderstandings, that maybe the universities had lost his records, that the certifications might be under a different name. None of it held up under scrutiny. The investigators found even more lies once they started looking. Positions he'd claimed at previous companies that he'd never actually held. projects he'd listed on his resume that didn't exist. His entire professional history was largely fabricated. And here's where it gets absurd. They pulled my original project files as part of the investigation, compared them to the presentation he'd given, and realized he'd stolen that too. One of the executives actually called me in and apologized directly, said they should have questioned why a manager who'd never shown that level of strategic thinking before suddenly had such a well-developed project. They asked why I hadn't said something during the presentation. I told them the truth, that I'd been shocked, that I hadn't known how to handle it in the moment, and that I'd worried speaking up would make me look like I was causing problems. They understood, which was something, but it didn't undo the fact that I'd sat there silent while my work was stolen. My manager was fired within a week. Not just fired, but walked out immediately. No notice period, no severance. The company treated it as a termination for cause based on the falsified credentials and the plagiarism. They made me the interim manager while they searched for a replacement, and gave me the bonus he'd received for my project, plus an additional amount as an apology. They also sent an email to the executive team and the broader department, giving me public credit for the original project. It was satisfying in a way, but also felt hollow because I shouldn't have needed to go through all of this just to get recognition for my own work. My former manager tried threatening legal action, sent me a cease and desist letter claiming I'd defamed him and damaged his career. His lawyer sent it to my personal email, which meant he'd somehow figured out I was the one who'd exposed him, though he couldn't prove it. I forwarded the letter to the company's legal department. They told me not to worry about it, that he had no case, and that if he actually tried to sue, they'd countersue for fraud and theft. Nothing came of it. The threats were empty, just a last attempt to intimidate me into feeling bad about what I'd done. But I didn't feel bad. He'd stolen from me, lied his way into positions he wasn't qualified for, and built a career on other people's work. Getting caught wasn't some unfair persecution. It was just consequences finally catching up. I got the permanent manager position about 2 months later. Better title, significant raise, actual authority to make decisions, and get credit for my own ideas. The whole experience left me cynical about corporate structures and how easy it is for people to fake their way into success. But it also taught me that documentation matters, and sometimes you have to be willing to fight for what's yours, even if the system isn't set up to make that easy. Sometimes trying to help someone backfires spectacularly, especially when you accidentally stumble into a cover-up nobody wanted discovered. I noticed my coworker Jenny seemed off for a few weeks. She'd always been pretty put together, organized, the type who had color-coded calendars and never missed a deadline. But lately she'd been showing up looking exhausted, snapping at people over minor things, and I'd caught her staring blankly at her computer screen more than once like she'd completely zoned out. We weren't close friends or anything, but we'd worked on the same team for about 2 years and had always gotten along fine. So one afternoon when she looked particularly stressed, I stopped by her desk and asked if she needed help with anything. Maybe she was underwater on a project, maybe she just needed someone to take something off her plate for a bit. She initially brushed me off, said she was fine, just busy. But I pushed a little, told her I had bandwidth and genuinely wanted to help if I could. She hesitated, then finally admitted she was behind on some reporting and could use assistance pulling together some financial reconciliations that were due at the end of the week. She gave me access to a shared drive where she kept her working files and walked me through what needed to be done. Basic stuff, comparing invoices against payments, making sure everything matched up, flagging any discrepancies. Tedious work, but straightforward. I started going through the files that evening, wanting to get a head start so I could give her something useful by the next morning. That's when I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Dates that had clearly been altered. You could see it in the file properties, where the created date and modified date were wildly different, and the formatting was inconsistent with the rest of the document. Duplicate invoices from the same vendor for the same services but with different amounts. Reports that showed payments going out but no corresponding entries in the budget tracking sheets. At first I thought it was just sloppy record keeping. Maybe she'd made errors while trying to catch up on backlogged work. Maybe files had gotten corrupted or duplicated by accident. It happens. Systems glitch, people make mistakes when they're rushing. But the more I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't accidental. The patterns were too consistent, the alterations too specific. Someone had deliberately manipulated these files, and they'd been doing it methodically over what looked like a considerable period of time. I didn't want to believe Jenny was involved in anything shady. She'd always seemed honest, competent, professional, but I also couldn't ignore what I was seeing. The next morning, I went to her privately and mentioned that I'd found some inconsistencies in the files. I kept my tone neutral, non-accusatory, just pointing out that some dates seemed off and there were duplicate entries that didn't match. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She went pale, actually looked like she might pass out. Then she grabbed my arm and pulled me into an empty conference room, shut the door, and begged me to forget about what I'd seen. Said it was complicated, that I didn't understand the full situation, that bringing it up would cause problems I couldn't imagine. I asked her directly what was going on. She wouldn't answer, just kept saying I needed to trust her and drop it. She looked terrified, which made me feel terrible because clearly she was in some kind of trouble, but I also knew I couldn't just pretend I hadn't seen evidence of what appeared to be financial fraud. I told her I couldn't ignore it, that if there were errors in the financial records, they needed to be corrected, and if there was something else going on, it was better to address it now than let it continue. She started crying, said I was going to ruin everything, and left the conference room. I spent the rest of that day feeling sick about the whole situation. I didn't want to get Jenny in trouble, but I also couldn't be complicit in covering up what looked like serious financial misconduct. That evening, I went to my supervisor and quietly explained that I'd been helping a coworker with some reports and had found significant discrepancies that I thought needed to be reviewed. My supervisor took it seriously immediately, asked me to send over examples of what I'd found, said they'd look into it discreetly. I forwarded a few of the most obvious files and tried to go about my normal work while feeling like I'd just pulled the pin on a grenade. And here's where it gets absurd. The company launched a quiet internal investigation, brought in forensic accountants to go through the financial records more thoroughly. What they found was way bigger than I'd initially realized. Jenny hadn't been working alone. She and another manager, someone in procurement, had been running an embezzlement scheme for at least 3 years. They'd been creating fake vendor invoices for services that were never actually provided, approving the payments themselves through their respective roles, and splitting the money. The amounts were usually small enough to avoid triggering automatic flags in the system, but over 3 years it added up to over $200,000. The altered dates I'd noticed were their attempts to make the timeline of payments look more legitimate. The duplicate invoices were cases where they'd gotten sloppy and billed the company twice for the same fake service. It was sophisticated enough to avoid casual detection, but fell apart completely under forensic scrutiny. When the company confronted them with the evidence, they tried to claim I'd misunderstood the files, that I didn't have the full context, that there were legitimate explanations for everything I'd flagged, that I was making accusations based on incomplete information. But the forensic accountants had already traced the money. They had bank records showing payments to shell companies that Jenny and the procurement manager controlled. They had documentation of invoices that didn't match any actual contracts or purchase orders. They had everything. Both of them were fired immediately. The company pressed criminal charges. Last I heard, they were both facing prosecution for embezzlement and fraud, potentially looking at jail time, depending on how the case played out. I felt horrible about the whole thing. Not because I regretted reporting it, I knew I'd done the right thing, but because I genuinely liked Jenny, and it was hard to reconcile the person I'd worked with for 2 years with someone who'd been systematically stealing from our employer that entire time. The company thanked me privately. My supervisor said I'd potentially saved them from much larger losses if the scheme had continued, and that my willingness to come forward when I saw something wrong was exactly the kind of integrity they valued. They offered me Jenny's position, actually, with a significant raise, which felt weird to accept, but I eventually did. Things went from bad to unhinged when the story started spreading through the office. People who'd worked with Jenny were shocked, couldn't believe she'd been involved in something like this. Some of them seemed almost angry at me for reporting it, like I should have just kept quiet and let it go. A few people stopped talking to me, treated me like I was a snitch who'd gotten colleagues in trouble instead of someone who'd uncovered actual crimes. It was isolating in a way I hadn't expected. I'd done the right thing, everyone acknowledged that intellectually, but emotionally some people seemed to hold it against me that I'd been the one to expose it. I still think about Jenny sometimes, wonder what led her to make those choices, whether she was desperate for money or just saw an opportunity and took it. Wonder if she regrets it, if she wishes she'd come clean when I first found the discrepancies instead of trying to cover it up further. The whole experience taught me that doing the right thing isn't always straightforward or comfortable. That sometimes helping someone means uncovering truths neither of you wanted to face, and that workplace relationships are complicated when professional obligations conflict with personal loyalty. I'm more careful now about what I agree to help with, not because I regret what happened, but because I'm more aware of the potential consequences of getting involved in other people's work. Sometimes offering to help opens doors you can't close, and you have to be prepared for whatever's on the other side. Alibis crumble fast when there's physical proof of where someone really was. And this next story, a single receipt, blew everything wide open. My partner told me they'd be at a work conference all weekend, 2 hours away in the city. It was one of those annual industry events they'd attended before. Nothing unusual. They left Friday afternoon, sent me a few texts that evening about how boring the keynote speaker was, and I didn't think anything of it. We had location sharing turned on through our family phone plan, one of those things we'd set up years ago for convenience and never really thought about after. Sunday evening they came home, tossed their bag in the bedroom, and started telling me about the conference, which sessions they'd attended, who they'd run into, the mediocre hotel breakfast, all the normal details you'd expect from a weekend business trip. I was cleaning out their car on Monday, just tidying up because it had gotten cluttered, when I found a receipt wedged between the seats. Gas station purchase, timestamped Saturday night at 9:30 p.m. Nothing weird about that initially, except when I looked at the location. It wasn't from the city where the conference was. It was from a small town about 20 minutes from where their ex lived. I stood there holding this receipt, trying to figure out why they would have been in that specific town when they were supposedly at a conference 2 hours in the opposite direction. There's no logical route between the conference city and our house that would take you through that area. You'd have to actively go out of your way to end up there. I asked them about it that evening, kept my tone casual. Hey, I found this gas receipt from Saturday. I thought you were at the conference all weekend. They barely glanced at it. Said they'd driven back early to grab something they forgot, then headed back to the conference. They'd forgotten to mention it because it was quick and didn't seem important. The explanation felt off. Driving 4 hours round trip in the middle of a conference weekend to grab something from home would be a huge disruption. And if they'd actually done that, they probably would have mentioned it, or I would have noticed them stopping by the house. I didn't push it right then, but later that night I checked our shared location history. It's one of those features where you can see where family members have been, ostensibly for safety, but also just useful for things like, where did we park at that restaurant last month? I pulled up Saturday on the timeline. They hadn't been at the conference hotel. They'd been near their ex's address for hours, from around 6 p.m. until almost 11 p.m. Their phone had pinged from that area repeatedly. Then they'd driven back to the conference hotel, where they stayed the rest of the weekend. My hands were shaking looking at that map. All those little location dots clustered around their ex's neighborhood. During hours they'd told me they were at conference networking events. I confronted them the next morning, showed them the location history, showed them the receipt, asked them to explain what they'd actually been doing Saturday night. They got flustered, started stumbling over their words, then finally admitted they'd stopped by their ex's place to return some old stuff. Books or something they'd borrowed years ago, they said. They'd been meaning to do it for a while, and since they were kind of in the area, they figured why not just drop them off. I asked why they'd lied about it. If it was really that innocent, why not just tell me they were going to return some things to their ex? Why make up a story about driving home for something they forgot? They got defensive then, said they knew I'd be weird about it, that I'd make it into a bigger deal than it was, so they just didn't mention it. Said it wasn't worth the drama, and they were right, because look how I was reacting. That response told me everything I needed to know. They weren't sorry for lying, they were annoyed they'd been caught, but that wasn't even the worst part. I couldn't let it go. Something about the whole situation felt wrong beyond just the lie about returning books. So later that week, when they were in the shower, I checked their phone. I know that's a violation of privacy. I know it's not great. But at that point, I felt like I was owed some answers, since clearly I wasn't getting them through honest conversation. The texts with their ex went back weeks, flirty messages, nostalgic conversations about their relationship, inside jokes and references to memories they'd shared, recent messages from the week before the conference where they'd specifically planned to meet up while they were in town for work. The ex had even joked about it being risky, and my partner had responded with something about what I didn't know wouldn't hurt me. I felt physically sick reading through them, not just because of the content, but because of how casual it all was, how easily they'd planned this whole thing, lied to my face about where they'd be, and then come home and acted completely normal. I took screenshots of everything. Not because I was planning to do anything with them, but because I knew if I confronted them again, they'd probably try to deny it or minimize it, and I wanted proof of what I'd seen. That night, I told them it was over. I showed them the texts, told them I knew they'd been planning to see their ex for weeks, that the conference was just convenient cover for a meetup they'd been arranging behind my back. They immediately started damage control, swore nothing physical had happened, that they'd really just talked and caught up, that the flirty texts were just their communication style, but didn't mean anything serious. They said I was overreacting, that, yeah, they should have been honest, but I was blowing this completely out of proportion. I told them the physical aspect didn't even matter to me at this point. They'd systematically lied to me for weeks, planned a secret meetup with their ex, drove hours to spend an evening with them, and then came home and pretended everything was normal. The betrayal wasn't just about what might or might not have happened with their ex. It was about the calculated deception, the ease with which they'd constructed an entire false narrative. They kept insisting nothing had happened, like if they could just convince me it was platonic, then somehow the lying wouldn't count as much. But I was done. The trust was completely shattered, and I couldn't imagine a scenario where I'd ever believe anything they told me again. I started moving my stuff out that weekend, stayed with a friend initially while I looked for my own place. They alternated between begging me to reconsider and getting angry that I was throwing away our relationship over what they kept calling a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. They'd lied, gotten caught, lied again to cover the first lie, and only admitted the truth when confronted with evidence they couldn't talk their way around. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a pattern of dishonesty. The hardest part was realizing how long they must have been planning it. The text showed this wasn't spontaneous. They'd been coordinating with their ex, looking forward to it, making jokes about keeping it secret, and they'd been perfectly comfortable lying to me the entire time. I found my own apartment about 3 weeks later. Single bedroom, affordable, far enough from our old place that I wouldn't run into them accidentally. Started rebuilding my life without them in it, which was harder than I expected because we'd been together for years and our lives were pretty intertwined. They tried reaching out a few times in the months after. Texts apologizing, asking if we could talk, saying they'd made a huge mistake. I didn't respond. What was there to say? They'd shown me exactly who they were when they thought they wouldn't get caught, and I believed them the first time. The lie was enough. Even if nothing physical happened with their ex, even if it really was just talking and nostalgia, the systematic deception killed whatever we had. You can't build a relationship with someone who's comfortable lying to your face about where they are and who they're with. Eventually, you drive yourself crazy trying to verify every story, checking every receipt, and that's no way to live. I'm in a better place now. Learn to trust my instincts when something feels off. Learn that finding evidence of dishonesty isn't a violation when someone's already violated your trust. And learn that sometimes the trash takes itself out. You just have to be willing to let it go. Neighbors can be nightmare fuel, especially when they try to destroy your reputation, but forget they've got their own cameras running. I started noticing people in the neighborhood acting weird around me about 3 months ago. People I'd always been friendly with would suddenly find reasons to cross the street when they saw me coming. Conversations would stop when I walked up. I'd get these tight, polite smiles instead of actual greetings. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as me being paranoid or people just being busy. Then my next-door neighbor, an elderly woman I'd helped with her groceries multiple times, straight up avoided eye contact with me and hurried inside when I waved. That's when I knew something was actually wrong. I finally cornered a guy from 2 houses down who I'd always gotten along with and asked him directly what was going on. He looked uncomfortable, said he didn't want to get involved, but eventually admitted that my neighbor, I'll call him Derek, had been telling people I was running some kind of dangerous business out of my home. Derek had apparently been spreading rumors that I was harassing his family, making them feel unsafe, being aggressive and unstable. I was genuinely confused. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer. My dangerous business consisted of me sitting at a computer in my spare bedroom, designing logos and websites. I'd barely interacted with Derek or his family beyond the occasional wave when we were both checking the mail. I had no idea where any of this was coming from. I confronted Derek the next time I saw him outside, kept it calm, just asked him directly if he'd been telling people I was harassing his family or running some kind of problematic business. He denied everything, said he had no idea what I was talking about, suggested maybe people had misunderstood something he'd said. He was smooth about it, convincing even, and for a second I almost believed him. But the rumors didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. I decided I needed evidence of what was actually happening, so I installed security cameras. One facing my driveway, one covering my front door, basic home security that I probably should have had anyway. Within a week, Derek started appearing in the footage. He'd come into my driveway, not all the way up to my door, but close enough to be clearly on my property, and just stand there staring at my house. Sometimes he'd pace back and forth. A few times he yelled, claiming I was spying on him with my cameras, that I was obsessed with his family, that I needed to leave them alone. In every single clip, I either wasn't home or I was inside, ignoring him completely. I never engaged, never yelled back, never even acknowledged his presence. But he was creating these scenes in my driveway where he was the victim of harassment that wasn't actually happening. I started recording these incidents on my phone too, whenever I was home and heard him outside. Got clear footage of him standing in my driveway, screaming about how aggressive and unstable I was, while I stood silently on my own porch, just watching him have a meltdown. The breaking point came when he posted in the neighborhood Facebook group. It was this long, dramatic post about how he and his family felt unsafe because of their aggressive neighbor who was constantly surveilling them and creating a hostile environment. He didn't name me directly, but it was obvious who he meant. People in the comments were supportive of him, saying how terrible it was that he had to deal with this, offering to help however they could. I'd had enough. I wasn't going to let this guy destroy my reputation in my own neighborhood with complete fabrications. I had a mutual acquaintance who was friends with Derek's wife. I asked her, very politely, if she could request the footage from Derek's doorbell camera for a specific set of dates and times. I gave her the exact timestamps of incidents where he'd been in my driveway yelling. I said I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page about what had actually happened. She was hesitant but agreed, probably because she was starting to suspect Derek's story didn't add up. Derek's doorbell camera had a clear view of my driveway and part of my front yard. The footage she got back showed everything from his perspective. Him walking onto my property unprovoked. Him standing there yelling while I either wasn't home or was calmly standing on my own porch, not engaging. Him gesturing wildly and shouting about harassment while I did absolutely nothing aggressive. Multiple incidents, all captured by his own security system, all showing that his version of events was completely fabricated. I posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group. Didn't editorialize, didn't attack him personally, just uploaded the videos with timestamps and a simple caption explaining that these were from Derek's own doorbell camera and showed what had actually been happening. The response was immediate. People were shocked. The narrative flipped completely. Suddenly everyone could see that he'd been the aggressor, that he'd been creating drama where none existed, and that he'd been lying to the entire neighborhood about me for months. Derek tried to do damage control. He claimed I'd somehow edited his footage, that it was taken out of context, that there were other incidents not shown in the clips. He deleted his original post and tried to walk back his accusations, saying there had been misunderstandings on both sides. But it was his own camera, his own footage. There was no credible way to claim it had been doctored or manipulated when it came directly from his security system. People aren't stupid. They could see what had really been happening. The neighborhood turned on him hard. People who'd been sympathetic started calling him out for lying. The homeowners association got involved because he'd been harassing me on my own property, which violated community rules. His wife looked mortified every time I saw her, though I genuinely felt bad for her because she'd been dragged into her husband's weird campaign against me. Things got progressively more uncomfortable for him after that. People stopped engaging with him at neighborhood events. He'd try to make small talk and get polite but cold responses. The social capital he'd built up by playing the victim evaporated once everyone realized he'd been manufacturing the entire conflict. He moved out about 6 months later. I heard through the grapevine that he'd gotten a job in another city, But I suspect the real reason was that he couldn't handle living in a neighborhood where everyone knew he'd been caught lying. His wife and kids seemed relieved to leave, honestly. I still live here. My reputation recovered pretty quickly once the truth came out. People apologized for believing the rumors, said they should have asked for my side of the story before making assumptions. I don't hold it against them because Derek had been convincing, and they had no reason to doubt him until they saw evidence otherwise. The whole experience taught me that documentation is everything. If I hadn't installed those cameras, if I hadn't gotten his own footage to prove what was really happening, his lies might have stuck. I could have been forced to move because my neighbors believed I was the problem. It also taught me that some people will create entire narratives to justify their behavior or to make themselves feel important. Derek needed to be the victim of something, so he invented a conflict with me and then escalated it until it consumed both our lives for months. The fact that none of it was real didn't matter to him. The drama was the point. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're officially part of the Reddit drama family, and honestly, I love that for us. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember, screenshots don't lie, security footage doesn't forget, and karma has a long memory. I'll be back tomorrow with more stories that will make you double check your own texts. Sleep well and maybe check your receipts.